Hey, how's it going, everyone? Welcome to my presentation. Today I'll be presenting about the departure delays from the New York City metro area. All right, let's get started. So what we're really focusing on? We're really focusing on the frustrations of flying out of the New York City metro area from three airports, LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark, and the flight departure delays that we always experience. For this experiment, though, I'll be specifically focusing on the summer months. So, as I aforementioned, we're looking at the three airports out of that area, LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark. And then my data source, I retrieved all my data from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics for the months of June, July, and August for 2019. And then my target audience, friggin' business and leisure travelers. All right, so we're really focusing on the delays, and now we need to know, okay, what makes my flight delayed? When you're standing there and you're wondering, why is my flight delayed? Why can I not get out of here? And I'm sure many of us flying out of that area have always experienced that, where we're thinking, why is this happening to me? So there are a plethora of different types of delays. So as far as the FAA goes, they categorize them as air carrier delays, extreme weather delays, so National Aviation System delays. So really we're looking at air traffic control, late arriving aircraft, and security delays. And one other thing to keep in mind is the FAA considers a delay if it's more than 15 minutes past its departure time that it was due to leave. All right, so here we really have it. Total departure delay in minutes for those 3 months. Lo and behold, we have LaGuardia as the number one essentially, and then Newark is coming in very close in second, and then JFK is falling off at third. The biggest contributor to a delay here is late aircraft. So one thing to explain about the late aircraft, all the information that's there is saying that the aircraft is late. Why the aircraft is late, we're not particularly sure as far as why that goes, and that's not what we'll be focusing on in this study. We're just looking at whether a plane is departure delayed or on time. So as far as a late aircraft goes and why it's delayed, it could be a plethora of different reasons. It could be a weather delay, it could be maybe a carrier delay at the other airport, or security delay at the other airport, so etc. But again, just for this study, we're focusing on primarily the delay versus on time, and then late aircraft, we're just looking at that specific one, nothing underneath that. All right, so feature selection. So now we have to really cut down to what is going to impact my delays. So initially, I started off with day of the week, so I really wanted to see if you traveled Monday through Sunday, which day was the worst to take off. And then departure time, so obviously if you're traveling in the morning versus afternoon versus evening, that's going to impact the model. Different carriers have different policies that potentially impact their delays and their on time. Origin, in this case, we're just looking at those three airports in that area. Destination, so flying, let's say from New York City to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's very close, so going to assume that'll be a smaller aircraft, more of those shuttlecrafts, and less logistics to deal with. But then, obviously, if you're flying New York City to LA, large aircraft, more people, more logistics to deal with. And finally, distance. So distance and destination kind of correlate with one another. All right, so future importance. Here you have it. And this is what we came down to, departure time. Departure time by a long shot impacted the most out of the study as far as what impacts the delays. So this makes sense as far as if my flight leaves at 6 a.m. and then it's delayed, then the flight leaving at 7 a.m. when it's coming into taxi, potentially in that same gate, it's going to have to wait longer because that time that flight, earlier flight was supposed to leave, it's still there at the gate. So now you have the 7 a.m. flight having to leave, and they will have to stay on the runway longer. So this would make sense, and it becomes a cascading effect. If one flight is delayed earlier, the next flight, and the next flight, and the next flight, etc. Distance and destination came neck and neck in second, and this also makes sense because, again, we talked about the logistics issue. Then we had day, and then carrier, and then origin. Makes sense as far as why it's lower of a feature importance because we're only looking at 3 airports, so hence why we're in the same geographical area here. All right, so before I ran my model, I really want to see the class imbalance. I want to see which way the data was leaning towards. So here, obviously, you see it's leaning more towards on time versus delays. So I didn't want this to skew my model. So with that being said, what I ended up doing was running balancers to balance my model. So I looked at random oversampler, SMOTE, Addison, and random undersampler. Eventually, I settled with random oversampler and SMOTE. Reason being, I didn't pick random undersampler was because it would potentially take away on-time data points, and I didn't want that. I wanted to keep all my data points. Addison just wasn't as balanced, but then SMOTE and random oversampler were very well balanced. However, I had to pick between the two as far as what I wanted to be my number one. I would keep the other one just to compare, but I ended up settling with SMOTE. And the reason being is because if you look at my true delays, my on times, and then my false delays, and then false on times, they're more balanced out in comparison to random oversampler, where the true delays was 15,000, and then the false delays were like 17, and the true on times were 15,000 again. The false delays were like 6, or false on times were 6, excuse me. So with that being said, it just didn't seem right to me, and I had a discussion with my instructor and classmates, and it just seemed like that was a little too good to be true. So that's why I decided to run with SMOTE and then go with this as my number one, along with the next models that I'll be showing you. So as far as picking my models, I decided to look into k-nearest neighbors, logistic regression, Gaussian naive Bayes, decision tree classifier, random forest classifier, and gradient boosting classifier. So I ran all these models. So first I ran it without a balancer, and then I ran it with a random oversampler, and then SMOTE. So ultimately, I had a high score for decision tree classifier, but because that's part of the random forest classifier, I decided to override it with the random forest. So I went with that, and then I also picked gradient boosted classifier. So these will be the models I focus on, and as you recall, I was going to focus on SMOTE as my number one as far as balancing goes, but between these two, one of the issues I had was when I ran the balancer for random forest classifier, it was just a little too high. It was that issue that I was running into where it was like 15,000, 15,000, and 17, 17. So it just didn't make sense to me. And the scores were extremely high as well. And I hadn't done any sort of parameter tuning at that point. So at this point, I'm looking at random forest classifier, gradient boosted classifier, and then I'm running SMOTE and random oversampler and comparing those. So I did those, and then I also ran my cross-validation, and once again, random forest classifier, I continued to give me high scores in like the lower 90s, and I hadn't done even parameter tuning to it. So it just, the balancing didn't make sense, that score didn't make sense, and I knew the recall precision F1 and accuracy scores were being impacted by that nearly perfect balance. So I really had to focus more on gradient boosted classifier and SMOTE, because those are giving me more, I guess you could say, scores that I could justify. It would make sense. Like, okay, yes, this makes sense. I went through this iterative process as far as how we got here. So once I did hyperparameter tuning for those, I did end up getting nice scores, higher scores in 90s across. This is obviously not rounded to the 10th place, but it was still higher scores. However, at this point, I could say, all right, this makes sense just because I've looked at the balancing. All right, that made sense. And then I also looked at the hyperparameter tuning as well. And so all those looked pretty good as far as this goes. So I thought, okay, you know what? I can definitely work with this, and this is fine. Future iterations, I would like to continue to look into it as far as seeing, okay, did I miss something? Is there a reason these scores are high like this? But as of right now, I went through the iterative process, and I made sure that I went through the proper steps, and then these are my scores. So I was confident in calling gradient boosted classifier with SMOTE to balance. And then my ROC AOC curve was 0.95. So with this being said, again, I would want to do some future research as far as looking into, okay, like did I miss something? Obviously, it's a high score, but because when you have high scores like this, you always want to make sure it's like, all right, this is nearly too perfect. Like, why is it so perfect? However, if it's perfect, it's perfect. Yeah, I mean that's just an excellent model. However, you always want to look through your process, make sure that you didn't miss anything, make sure that you potentially didn't kind of almost, I guess you could say, like cheat the model in a sense. So, anyways, I essentially ended up with gradient boosted classifier and SMOTE. So this is what I went with. And then I have a Tableau dashboard for you. So before I actually get this video started, let me go ahead and open it. So I'm going to pause it right here. And so if you look to the left, these are all the airports that you have flights going to from Newark, LaGuardia, and JFK. On the right, you have all the map. And then at the bottom, you have the average delays by time and day. Just to give you an indication as far as the colors go, the red on the map just indicates the cities. The blue at the bottom shows, if it's blue, it means it's less average delay, and if it's red, that means it's a high average delay. So what I'm showing right now is each individual city. So you can see average departure delay, 100 minutes, 50 minutes, and that's if there's a delay. And then San Francisco, average arrival delay, now we're looking at the other end of it. And then now we're looking at the times, average departure delay, again, if there is a delay, and then by day and by time. So then we click on a city, and now it shows you only that city and the statistics for that. Same thing with Chicago. Chicago, as you can see, the delays aren't bad if there is a delay. And then LA, again, this kind of goes with my entire theory as far as, okay, the further you go, the harder it becomes. Okay. So sorry, to finish it off. So basically, future iterations, and then we're looking at highest impact, and then departure time and distance, and then as far as the model goes, so looking at the gradient boosted classifier at SMOTE, and then future iterations, what I really want to work on is just the multi-class problem. So why was the delay? Instead of just looking at delayed versus on time, looking at, okay, is there a weather delay? Is there a carrier delay? Like what type of delay it is? So this will be something I do for the future, but besides that, that is my presentation and my model. Any questions?